for cleaning the data, essentially our process, and this comes from, yeah, I mean, a lot of people, but also like probably the Jeremy Howard, right? This is more from like data science type curriculum. Jeremy Howard does like the Fast AI courses, and he'll basically say, hey, like kind of what you want to do is basically, get your data, kind of as quickly as possible, like clean it to be the right data type. Now it takes various amounts of work to do that. So, but if there's kind of like easy ways to convert it to the proper data type, do so. And then from there, you can continue to clean it. But basically just do like quick and dirty type cleaning, meaning, don't spend more than like 10 minutes or less probably on each column. Maybe like less than that, like a minute or so, like on each column. For us, what does that mean? It's like identify everything that's of type string, right? All our objects, and then try to convert it. It also means adding the date part. So that's also just like very significant. All these should be of type string, right? And they kind of do their job as it, right? They just allow us to identify. And then any of these, if they weren't integers, right, we should probably convert them, especially the target, right? The target, as you'll see, like we spend more time on the target because it influences basically everything else, right? If we're having various features predict our target, those features are going to be worthless for that row, all the features, if we don't have this one target, right? It's like how do any of them contribute to the output if we don't know what the output is? We can't determine that. And then of course we can get a lot from datetime. So really we're, part of the point is like we're able to make these changes pretty quickly, right? We have our add date part function. Just call it. You actually don't need to understand it too deeply. If you want to go through it, that's fine. But it's like the whole purpose of it is just to produce all these other features. And again, we can do that for any column that has a date time. So for instance, if it was like a user sign up time, we could have potentially two sets of datetime features. And then the next thing is check the representativeness of the data. For us, we focused in on the time column, okay, which makes sense, right? If we're talking about how groupings can hide our data, we already are at a pretty atomic unit with our customers, I think, and probably also with our products. Like it's hard to think of how this is hiding some data there, unless there's like multiple people, like it's like a family sign up as the customer ID, like your Netflix subscription, as opposed to like an individual. But there's that doesn't seem like we can dig deeper on that. So really it's like the timing. Why? Because any kind of grouping, like timing always involves a grouping, right? Whether it's the week, the month, the year, right? Like how do we know that we have the entire month and especially like the entire year? So what I saw, right, was, if you just kind of do a histogram, you can see we basically have hardly any data in 2016, and all of our data is coming in 2017, 2018. Now you can group by the month, right? But that's not exactly what's going to work for you because, right, we're going to have, this is aggregated across all the years, So, like, say we're missing, August data in 2018, but we have it in 2017, right? This histogram is going to cover that up, right? We might just be missing that data. So we want to be able to detect that. So this is what I did, right? So it's like, okay, let's instead look at it individually, and I think we plotted it by week. Oh, purchases across days. So we can see we're steadily growing, but we do have data throughout all this time period, right? You could ask, like, does this make sense, right? I would probably like ask someone in like on the business side, right? Like, does this make sense that that this is growing, or is this a feature of us not collecting the data as well, or does this represent like true growth? And then in 2018 we do the same thing, right? So this is day one it should be through day 365. Now here it seems like we have all 365 days, but in this place we don't, right? So even though, I think the point is like, even though you look at 2018, and wherever it was here, and you're like, oh, well, we have way more sales here. This must be representative. That's not true, right? Because we only have it for 2/3 of the year in this case. So what does that mean? Like, how do you do your analysis? The way I did it was uh, actually by selecting like a full year, going back from the end day here back 1 year, right? And that way, at least we have one continuous kind of year, even if it's not the calendar year, all right? And you can do some analysis there. The other thing, but you could probably go back further. It's like when we have continuous days, and the benefit of that would be, let's say it's like 16 months we get to work with, but at least we can track year over year growth for maybe four of those months, right? And 4 of those weeks. And that's really valuable in kind of an e-commerce retail type of thing. In retail stores, typically what they're looking at is like the kind of critical metric is same store sales for the same week, right? Year over year, right? So it's like week of January, first week of January, what did we do last year across these stores, and how did that change? So that's why, as long as you have that data, you can go back in time and kind of at least see some trend data. And then of course, then the other thing I think I was looking at was just the target. The target's valuable, right? As we said, it's like probably of the columns, your most important one. So you want to make sure that there's not outliers there, that it actually is sensible. Let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, exactly. I'm looking to see, like, are there any kind of outliers that's really going to pull my data in one direction or another, right? Remember that if you're doing something like taking the average, and then you have something that's put in as like $4,000, well, that's going to pull, that's really going to influence your average sales data. So you want to make sure that that's accurate. So you can see, I just take a look at it, and you can kind of look up then from there. Does this information make sense? Like maybe this is like a keyboard or something. This is, I think, like laser tag. I'm not sure. So yeah, maybe they actually did have those types of products, right? So this is kind of what I say is like, also like identify the grain of the data, identify the target, right? By grain of the data, we mean what does each row represent? In this case, I think each row is a purchase of a product by a customer, right? It's not a shopping cart, right? It's, and then we cleaned it up, and that mainly involved our add date part. And then it was selecting the data. And you could see how easily I think it is to get fooled by the data, by this selecting a correct time period. Because again, it may look like you have all of 2018 data, but you don't, right? So that's a pretty big miss if you miss that, right? To walk into a meeting, say you did all this analysis, and then not realize you only have 2/3 of the data. Okay, so those are the main things there. So it's like, as long as you're able to focus your time, you can see that really what we just did the exploration of was the time data and the target. And the other thing I would focus in on is like looking through the columns. If I'm grouping by, do I actually have that group? If I'm saying, if I'm doing some analysis on a school, do I have all of that school's data, right? If not, what percentage of it am I missing? Again, like, are there certain schools where we do have basically all the data, and then maybe instead we should just use that proportion, that only those data points, and do analysis there. Okay. Cool. The next thing is the exploring data solution. I don't think I have to go through all of this. I'm pretty sure like the reading probably does. I would say read through this. It does a good job. But the main thing I would say is just that, you can see it's just that once you clean the data, you can basically explore all of the columns, right? That's the other kind of technique is that, and this is different than how they would teach this in a data analysis course that wasn't taught by people that know, wasn't for people that know how to code. Right there, like the typical thing is like, develop a hypothesis and like figure out like what do you think's going on, and then gather the data. But if you have the data, and there is some of that that's true, but if you have like the data sets and you have it already, and you have these various features already, then it's very easy, meaning it just doesn't take that long to print all of them and see what's available. That doesn't mean you have, that doesn't mean there's not more data out there that could explain better what's going on. And maybe so you still should do that kind of analysis or thinking through that to see what other data should you really try to gather, or what other department should you talk to see what else could be going on. But if you have 30 features, 30 different columns, explore them all, because we have a function and the ability to just display all of them pretty quickly. So that's kind of the main thing, because you don't know where the significance is, but it's easy enough just to look at it. So you can see, right, we saw that, like these cities were kind of top. So we're able to pretty quickly kind of see that typical clumping, and you just consolidate the information in your brain, right? Like these 4 cities dominate, great. Then with columns, it's like these 4 dominate, great. This is valuable too. It's like if you have this zip code data, right? This is really useful because why? Because income and a lot of things vary by zip code. Right, you have certain neighborhoods that different ethnicities are going to go into. You have certain neighborhoods that just like that have different income levels or different values, right? Different like social political values too, and that just represents the different kinds of individuals. And from your perspective, that represents like if there's trends in who's buying what kinds of products. Well, that's valuable to take advantage of. So seeing that on a more granular level, like zip codes, can be really interesting. Also because there's tons of information by zip code, right? Like there's the census, and you can map the data. If you have the zip code, then you can map that with census data, and there's even more additional data. There's voting data, et cetera, and get a picture as to who these customers are, and then try to find similar kinds of zip codes that match, right? So that's why doing it, again, we're kind of like, if you think about it, this is just another case of let's get to a more atomic unit, and actually it's richer information if you do that. And you can see that, like, I think it's, the cumulative percentage, it's hard to get too high, but you can at least identify like a top 10. And I found that the top 10 zip codes account for 15% of sales, and the top 13% of zip codes account for 50% of sales. Right? So basically what, my just instinct would be select that data and then see how do these individuals look differently than our overall our zip codes, and target those kinds of zip codes in the future or cater to them, right? Pay a little bit more attention. And the other thing you could do if you were actually like at the company, you would visit them. Right, you would just like, okay, these look the same. They're doing better. Let's also just see what's going on. Talk to the managers, etc. Same thing for products. It's the same exact process. Select them, see what the top ones are, dig deeper, and then I think the other thing was, then I saw what was. Let's see. It does look like where are these products selling, right? If zip codes is kind of so interesting, like we can look at where are our top products selling, and it also is probably just makes sense that you have these different kinds of customers through different regions. So if this is your most valuable product, maybe you can just sell those kinds of products in different places. And then I also bring up just for inventory purposes. Make sure that you're, having those shelves filled, to the stores that need them. All right. So this is pretty good. It's not consolidated, but it just shows you basically just like using our typical functions, pressing Shift Return on the keyboard a lot. You can get a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Okay. I don't think there's too much more. The other I mean, if I was like, if we had more time, I would plot this data too, like meaning like geographically plot it on a map and see what's going on. Because it would show you, right, like maybe you have 5 zip codes in the same region or something like that, and maybe that's related to who knows what. Like either it could be related to the demographics, it could be related to like the marketing, it could be related to the sales or the team that maybe controls that region. So that would be interesting too. But overall points of this is, like explore everything, basically, like plot everything. It doesn't take that long, especially with, this function. I didn't plot it all at once just so I can, group it together a little bit in my mind. And then summarize as you go as to like what you're seeing. And then dig deeper into where you see the differences, like where you see those, kind of clumps. And then, we just saw also that like, oh, like there's a lot in terms of, the zip code. That's pretty interesting to see. You might also see it in terms of maybe if we had more information about the sales per week, like that's another grouping that you can break down. Okay. But it was it's fairly consistent. Nothing too unexpected, I don't think, here. Questions about this? I mean, I would encourage you to go back through the solutions here, just to look them over when we're done. All right, cool. So we can talk about kind of like communication. One thing to say is just, I think I've said this before, is, when I first taught this, I think it was, some people are like, oh, I'm really good at, I'm a really good people person. I'm really good, like, communicating, like, in general. But that's not really the same thing exactly, like, what we're talking about. We're talking about, like, communicating professionally, which is a different thing than, like, how social you think you are, right? Like, this is just, how do you take various pieces of information, organize them, and communicate them clearly ideally making a case for certain actions, right? And that's a skill. Like that takes practice, and there are courses on it, and right, that's why we're spending time on it here. It's also very, very valuable. And for me, like, we covered it extensively, like in law school. I took various business school classes, the same thing, like, various graduate schools will dedicate way more time to this than you'll get in like an undergrad degree, probably because they see how valuable it is in the workplace. So we're using like the classic kind of approach, which honestly, like having gone to law school, this comes from like a business school curriculum. In law school, they teach something very similar, just with different names. But this is like the pyramid principle, and the idea is, in the first slide, right, or this could be the first paragraph, it doesn't matter. You give kind of the key conclusion, all right? A way that they would put this is answers first, right? Tell us the answer right away. And don't wait till the end, don't wait till the middle. Give your recommendation. If not in the first slide, you'll see this in like the first 3 slides. Why would they wait that long? Well, maybe you need some setup of like showing what the problem is and then showing what our recommendation is. Then what you'll do is kind of you'll explain like why, right? Why this is, the way to go, right? It's like, well, these stores are, overall sales are flat. However, these stores are performing strongly in these regions. These types of stores have these kinds of customers, and because of that, we should explore these kinds of regions and these kinds of customers, and perhaps they're buying these kinds of products, right? Or it could just be like, we should, explore these kinds of customers, X, Y, and here are the reasons why, right? It's a growing segment. They, fit in line with, our products. They're currently, it's not, there's not a lot of competition there, right? And then what you do is you expand upon that in the subsequent slides, right? So each of those things that we said here about, hey, like this fits, this is a segment that's growing. Cool. Like you probably aren't going to put all that information in one slide. So then we need to prove that. So it's the same thing here, right? Like this is a growing segment, right? And now we need some evidence, either in the form of charts typically or some numbers showing that, right? There isn't a lot of competition for it, right? That would be this headline, and then we would want to show some evidence for that, right? Like the cost of acquisition has been pretty low so far, blah blah. Here's where they're located, and this is also where we're located, so it lines up, right? And now all of a sudden you're making a case, okay, that all supports our top line conclusion, right? So that by the end of it, you told people this, but their first question is still going to be, well, why should I believe you? And here you're making the case throughout, right? And you told them kind of what to expect up front. So like I said, answers first, start to the end as close as possible. It's okay to provide like a little bit of context, like set up the problem. And that's kind of another kind of approach is like start with a problem to solution. That's a lot of the way that I teach is like, hey, okay, we've done this so far, but we still have this issue. So here's this new technology or tool that we can use. So why answers first? It focuses our presentation, right? Like we don't have to talk about all of our analysis we've ever done on this topic, or even all of the analysis we've done the past week. We're only including information to support our conclusion, right? It tells the reader obviously what they'll get, and then it has this also approach of like starting broadly and then going narrowly, right? You want to get everyone on the same page. So in a way to do that is you start with like, as sales across the company have been, relatively flat, or you could, if you don't want to be so, if that feels controversial, it could be like, we are trying to expand. We have a goal of X, of increasing sales by 20% over the next year. Then the next thing is, so you're starting broadly with like very broadly, like the company mission potentially, or like the department's mission. To do that, we have an opportunity to target this segment. I think I gave the example that the first startup I joined as more of like a business role. My manager told me, because I like started try to onboard somebody, and he's like, that was a mess. He's like everything. Whenever you start the meeting, it's always we're trying to go from one city to 40 cities in the next 6 months, right? That is like the first line always, and then to do that, we need to do this. Right? So it's always just starting very, very broadly and then going there. So that's the other reason why this kind of like situation to answer can really help, and it forces you to kind of start broadly. Big problem to like your solution. And then, like I said, it's a pyramid, right? In the sense that this is your top slide, but then you have these supporting arguments, that literally like support the key conclusion. You can do this in a paragraph as well, right? Like it could be a slide, it could be an essay, in which case each of these bullet points are sentences, really, in a paragraph. But even those 3 points are there to support the conclusion. So I give the example, over the past 3 years, sales have been flat. However, right, that's the problem. However, we have seen consistent growth in the health and beauty section, especially among like women and 35 to 45. While we are not a market leader, consumers are enthusiastic, right? So it's, again, like we've seen growth here. We're currently not, like this is already kind of going into recommendation. And now here we finally are into the recommendation. We can grow sales in these products by focusing here, right? Like here's how we can do that. So again, like this is pretty actionable as well. Okay, now one question may be like, when do you construct this like pyramid principle thing? When do you actually start doing and putting together the presentation? And the truth is, you want to start doing this earlier than you would think. Meaning that, for example, there are some, say you're doing like a project, we give you some time to do a project. If you already have some information, all right, or this is like kind of a topic that you've studied, you may have a hypothesis about what's going on, and maybe you just don't have the data. What you can do is start filling in, writing out the slides, right? Just write out the top kind of headlines, and it's then your job to get the data. Now, the benefit of that is that it focuses you on what you need to explore to make a compelling argument, right? And you may not be able to get all the data, and your hypothesis might be wrong all of those things are true, but at least it helps you to like focus what you need to explore, right, and what you're missing, right? Because this way you're not just like, well, I have this data set, this proves it, which obviously isn't the case. You can still have like a gap. Maybe you just don't have the data for this. So doing this is called ghostwriting, right? Or at least that was the term I heard was taught. And the idea is, right, you can just write this out. You can even sketch out, like draw out, even if it's just like with pen and paper, some of the charts that you would want to support this, and then do the work of gathering the data. Now, of course, this is susceptible to what's called like confirmation bias, where you have a thought and you already confirm it. So you do have to like check for that, and you should, have counters in your head or written down. But, as I said, this can really help you focus a project by writing out kind of the structure first and then filling it in. And the other thing that's really helpful about it is that it allows you to show this project, show your kind of results, show the end to team members, to your manager, to whoever before it's even done. Very, very important. Why is that so important? Because typically what happens is you do like, a month worth of work, and then you show it to your manager, to the rest of the team, and they're like, wait, this isn't what I wanted, and two, it's wrong, right? So if instead you're able to kind of show them the presentation up front and what you're doing, right, and tell you it's wrong, it's not what I wanted, way earlier, that saves you an enormous amount of time. Okay, so again, why are we doing this? Like, this will be useful for a lot of you when we move into internships in a month. Okay, right? Like saying, hey, do you mind if I just sketch out a presentation? We don't have all the data yet. Here's kind of the plan, right? Here's what I have. Here's how I could see this going, right? And it won't take you that long to do. Maybe it will take you 2 hours. It could save you, like weeks worth of time, if not more. So this is really, really valuable. In product development, people use this all the time, right? When they think of like a minimum viable product. The idea is get something out the door to show to people, because we don't know what there's a lot of ambiguity in what customers will like. It's the same thing here, right? Get something kind of, put thought into it, but you can do a lot of this up front. And that way, you can show this to people and they can course correct you along the way. Right? So cool. Those are the main things that I wanted to cover, at least at this point, right? And there's, this whole day will basically be on this kind of information. But any questions about this stuff so far? Or any, disputes? Yeah, Conwall.
Yes, still not quite understanding it when you say that this should be done sort of upfront. What I understand so far is we will be having some data sets and we need to analyze them and then come up with a situation and the supporting arguments. But if we do it upfront, I'm not quite understanding even if the manager will know what sort of data we'll get out, what sort of analysis we'll get out of this. So how will he come up with a yes or no? That's what my question is.
Well, let's say, let's say you're making an argument that you say, well, we can go after, this consumer segment, customers 35 to 45. Maybe he'll say, and you say, here's why, right? It's growing, it's accessible to us, right? Maybe what he says is, like, he knows he's probably worked in the company for X number of years, and he'll be like, well, we can't do that, right? Like, that will take us away from this thing. We just don't have the capacity for this. So now, one, maybe that's true. Or two, maybe you can say, well, can I explore that a little bit more, right? Do you mind if I just take a couple of days and explore that, right? So now, instead of you going down through, a month, like I said, all this work, he's already kind of telling you, wait, this is not right, this, like, there's always going to be assumptions that you're kind of making, and this allows you to, show this to the team and see that. It also shows you, so that's kind of one, right, is like, you may think that this is like a road going down, or this is the way your presentation's taking you. You don't want to leave that for the end, right? Like another kind of technique is like by the time you give your presentation or communicate your results, less time people already have an understanding, if it's done right, like of what they are, right? Because they're brought on board throughout, at least like the key stakeholders are. So that's really valuable. Or he may just say like, hey, what about this? Okay, you're checking these three things, but a really important thing is like, do we have the capacity, right? Like to go through with this. So that's kind of the thing. The other thing, so that's one thing, is like they're going to check your assumptions. The other component is, I just wanted to point out, it's not the case that you're like given data sets and then you do the analysis, right? You're going to need to find, really lots of times what it is, if it's done properly, is you need to make the case for something, and then from there you need to collect the data, right? And so first it's, the data and data collection is for a purpose, right? So this can help you in terms of what data do I even need, right, to sufficiently make this case. For example, like the capacity thing. Maybe that's something that's not in my data sets, but I can ask about it. I can somehow get that information out there. Another thing, and then finally another thing, I think your question was also, so it helps you get the data. And then I think your question was also, well, how can we show him something if we don't know what's going on? You basically can have a hypothesis, and you'll see what's going. These are things you have to kind of see, right? What's occurring. So what you're doing is you're kind of showing him like this is a growing segment. Maybe that's what it feels like, but maybe that's you still have to explore this further, right? And either that's something you'll take out of the presentation, or you'll say like this is striking. It's not a growing segment. However, there's an opportunity to get a bigger slice of the pie or whatever it is. But either way, you're showing him kind of the work that you're going to be doing, and you're allowing him to say like, yes, that's a good approach, right? Like you still need to go in and fill in this information. That's a good approach. But wait a second, you're missing this, or we already know that, or this person already has that information. Ask them for it, right? Like this is a project management tool that's really helpful.
Yeah, I have one more quick addition to that, Jeff. I think there's a lot of little pros that come along. Like your teammates are going to thank you for good documentation throughout the course of a project from start to finish, and that's like a nice win. But also it's a way to break out of it's one thing to have 2 minutes in a stand up to tell your manager and your team what you're up to, what you're doing. It's also just a good way to if a piece of your hypothesis is I've identified this was what we're missing of it all, and there's going to be this extra step that's needed to collect this extra data, this extra analysis. It's kind of a good way for your manager to have more transparency and insight into, okay, wait, I might need to add an extra day to their time for this. Like it's a good way to without saying, hey, I need help, or without having to advocate for extra time, for extra additional work. Like it's just a nice way to organize things in such a way that your manager can check assumptions like Jeff said and have the visibility, but also be able to actually support you and not let you just kind of be adrift and suddenly having to fight for accommodations. It's kind of a win-win across the board to get this early and often.
Yeah, I think exactly, like the tendency lots of times from everyone is like, well, I don't know enough to put something down on paper, but it's you do you know enough to kind of organize your thoughts, and it does help with communication and just pushing back against kind of that other side of you that's like, again, like we don't know enough. This is not we have all the answers. This is the approach, right, that we're taking. This is our hypothesis. It has both a way of focusing you in terms of what you need, identifying for yourself if there's like holes in your argument. It's a good way of allocating your time so that you don't go too deeply. Like I can give you an example at Flatiron School. I had to make the case for the data science course, and we were able to make the case that people would purchase the course, but then we needed to do more work of, like here's a typical career path of the grads that we can ensure, right? Like for the career services team. So in other words, it evens out our analysis, right? My analysis was to focus on one thing and not, prove the case of one thing, but not enough of the other. And of course, I was given, another week to do that, and that was fine. But like that's another thing that can really help, because what if I wasn't given that extra week, right? So by writing this out, then we can be like, okay, we've proved this. Okay, we've proved this, but we haven't proved this yet. So it's a really nice like project management tool. Overall, and things will change, right? Like if you shift things around, things that you thought were right were incorrect, but this is really, as opposed to, it's really easy to get lost in the weeds in a data analysis project and even know where to get started. And so something like this can help tell you, all right, if I can do these things, then we're in pretty good shape. Let's start just knocking them out one by one by one. All right. So yeah, it can really help. All right. Cool. So, all right. So obviously there's various ways to go with the lab, but I think you want to start with the whole like start broad, go narrow, right? I gave you kind of this hint of like a general overview and then a deeper dive type of thing. Sometimes your presentation could just be the deeper dive and you don't really need the general overview, but I think some people would be comfortable for like if this is your first presentation, you want to do both. So a lot of it's really just the topic sentence, right? Like general overview, revenue is concentrated in a few key cities with non-essential items dominating sales is what I have. So this covers kind of both things in terms of here's the geographic date breakdown, which was prominent, and then here's the product breakdown, right? These were the two probably like key findings. And then you go deeper in that. So revenue concentrated in a few key cities, right? Out of 3,700 cities, the top 3 account for 25% in sales, right? And then you can show what they are. And then kind of here's my subpoint with Sao Paulo and Rio accounting for 21% combined. And then what I said here was like, well, wait a second, are these unexpected? Meaning like you can look at the populations of these. If these are the most populous cities, maybe that's not really any big news. So how does it compare to city population, the number of stores there, right? Or overall spending, meaning, like I guess like marketing and things like that. So for instance, like I just looked up, like Googled kind of population of Brazilian cities and saw, okay, well actually this Belo is a pretty large city, and Curitiba, apologies for butchering it, is also pretty large. And then, same thing, like top 5 products, right? This is on our second point. And you can see, like, I just Googled, obviously I don't speak Portuguese, but I just, Googled the translation of these. Skin and beauty, religious presence, house and bathroom, leisure sports, right? This is why I say non-essential items. So you can then, plot these and see that. But of course, like, it's a little tough to tell a story if you don't know what this stuff is, so you do want to Google it. And then same thing, like, okay, we did the sales, what about profitability? From there you can think about promoting, right, the higher margin products. 60%, and then this is interesting, I think itself, the remaining 60% of product categories account for only 5% of sales. So it's like, what do we need to have, like, and maybe the answer is yes, like you do need to house these things because otherwise people won't go into your store, but it is kind of worth thinking about, like, okay, do we need to have all of these different product categories if they only account for 5% of sales? And then I had a plot here. This is kind of like the overview, right, of what's the big points. You can think about like the different axes of how to break, or different dimensions in the data. So it's, sales by product, sales by geography, time would probably be another one. And typical is just like who, what, where, why, when can essentially be your axes. What products, where are they being sold, when, those types of things. Who would be like the stores or the salespeople. And then deeper dive, right? We saw this was kind of interesting, was the top performing zip codes, top 10% accounted for 45% of the sales. So like, if that's true, that's getting pretty close to, right, like our 80-20 rule. This is only 10% instead of 20% is accounting for almost half the sales, right? So, and the top 10 zip codes account for 15% of sales. So I say, like, we would want to plot these zip codes combined with other data, etc. And then this was interesting, right? The fixed telephony, I don't know what that is, accounts for 20% of sales in these zip codes, even though it's less than 1% overall. So I would probably try to figure out what's going on there, because it probably is like some sort of signal of differences in the kinds of customer than overall data. So just like again, I say, like, we can do a deeper dive into that product category, or qualitative, just literally call the stores and talk to them. And then same thing with the top zip codes, just like literally call them or ask the managers, or go there. And then obviously there's all this other information you can do. So one deeper dive is, in the main one, I think, is in the zip codes, and then we did a breakdown of just what products are being sold. And then here's another deeper dive in terms of the product itself, right? And then where and when is it being sold. And again, you want to look for differences in the data, whereas this product being sold as opposed to like overall products. So the main thing, though, is just like, I follow the principle of like start broad and go narrow, right? Revenue concentrated in a few cities. This are the few items. This kind of tells you the whole structure, and then kind of going into that, giving you an overview as to where the sales are breaking down, and then doing a next section of, hey, this is kind of interesting about our top performing zip codes. The next thing is just various kinds of charts, right? Like, we're going, obviously, as like in the terms of the data analysis work, a lot of our data is going to be used to produce various visualizations. It's probably easy to think, well, I can, there's thousands of different charts, but that's not true. There's like 5 charts, and we'll see, we're not going to use pie charts. So that's my first case, is like, don't use pie charts. So really you're talking about like 3, because bar charts and column charts are very similar. They're a little different. There's the line chart, and then there's like a scatter chart. And then everything's basically variations of these. So it's like, we really just need to learn like 4 charts. That's it. See, it's easier already. So why not use the pie chart? Like, I don't know, look at this thing. If we remove the numbers here, what does the chart actually communicate to you? Meaning, if you're trying to say how this breakdown, what's the significance of this breakdown, and even compare one segment versus the other, it's pretty hard to tell like the difference between A and B here. Or like, is how many more times is C than this segment? Or what proportion of C is this segment? It's really hard to actually compare things through a pie chart. So for this reason, basically everyone says don't use them. Multiple pie charts is even worse. Why? Now you have to not only compare segments within the pie chart, but across pie charts, and be like, what percentage is this versus this, right? We want our data. The whole point of a data visualization is it kind of makes the case for a certain action, right? And pie charts, in theory, are supposed to show us comparisons between the segments, but in practice, it's actually really hard to compare the segments, right? Like, is this larger than this or smaller than this? I just can't really tell. And then, like, the author of Storytelling with Data, Death to Pie Charts, it's not just her, like, again, like multiple, there's also this book I like called Say It With Charts, that I referenced down here. He makes the same exact argument. Don't use pie charts. Instead, you can use bar charts. So if you want to do the percentage thing, you can just put the percentages in a bar chart. It's fine. It works fine. And it's much easier to compare these segments based on kind of how large they are. And then you can obviously organize this, like here, if you could just show the top performing, sort them by the top performing to least, or whatever sorting makes worse. He also says, use the horizontal bar chart. Why is that? Here, the point he's illustrating here is you can label the horizontal bar chart in a way that's hard to do with the vertical bar chart. Okay, so this is just cleaner than the other one. The other thing I say is, use numbers or a scale. Don't use both. Right? You just communicate one thing once. Omit decimals if you don't need that level of detail. Meaning, like, just put 12%. You don't need 12.3% unless it's significant, which it probably isn't. But like everything in your chart should have a purpose and should communicate something. You want to remove clutter in the charts. So just take some time thinking about, is it necessary or not. Obviously there are column charts, but what I say is you can use column charts when there's a real sequence between the categories. For example, revenue per year would be an example of that, right? Like it's sequential, one year after the other, and you just read things left to right, as you know. So when you really care about that sequence and it's implying something, that's when bar charts come in handy. So here's different bar charts, right? Like, that this I think was taken from The Economist. And again, you can kind of see the sequence in time period. This is nice. I like, because the colors, right, are indicating something different, right? Like the advanced economies versus developing economies. Here's another kind of, I don't know, good bar chart. Same thing. You can see the labels are easy to do and break it down. But these are just all variations on a bar chart. You can just break them out through different segments if need be. So that's the main thing. You lean on horizontal bar charts. Don't use pie charts ever. And then column chart is good with sequential data. So we covered 2 of them. So then the next ones is the line chart. The line chart is good for sequential, for datetime data, effectively, right? Like where you're not doing the breakdown by year, but just like day by day or week by week. You can do sales. Right, this is the sales through 2001. So one thing to note about this is they're doing a good job of highlighting the the past data versus projected data. Notice they label it and they also do the dotted line. So that's nice thing to do. Here again, I think this is kind of important to emphasize. Remember, like the point is to communicate. Is your chart is evidence of a message. It's their support, a message. So they're kind of showing you. They're really emphasizing that here, right? They're saying like this is the baseline, kind of in variation we would expect, and now here we're way outside of the baseline. So you could have thought of like how they can mark up the chart, right? They could have put dots here, but to mark the different years. But that's not the point, right? Like all these annotations are there to communicate a top line point. And we'll get to like annotations, but they can be just very valuable in terms of like, oh yeah, I can see that. Like what's going on here? So that's kind of the main point. It is you want these the whole purpose of the chart is to communicate a message. Okay. And then here's other kinds of like line charts that you may see, but this is obviously poor. So he calls this like the spaghetti chart. Now, why? Because it's so hard to pull out information from here. Like you want me to follow like A, B, C, and D across these lines. That's impossible. So instead, the broader point is break it out into multiple charts. Like, if A is what we're following, maybe this is our company versus the competitors, break out A versus B, A versus C, A versus D, A versus E, right? And obviously you can leave some of these out. And then, there's our favorite BCG chart, which, I spoke about. If you're showing, I put it here because it shows differences over time. If you're showing differences over time as well as, current, how well we're doing currently, right? Like it's nice, you can show this across 2 axes, right? So these are our stars because they're both, high sales and high growth. Percentage change in sales is high. This is low sales, low growth. So these are like the dogs. You can like kill these. And then the cash cows are like, you're not going to get, even though this isn't growing a lot, it's still at the top. You're not going to get rid of it and like ruin your company. So again, this is just another kind of chart to show. So we covered kind of showing time, right? And that's just or showing sales over time or any kind of metric over time. Uh, the other thing, and that's the line chart. The other thing is then the scatter chart. This is showing, correlations between data. Okay, so here the target's always on the y-axis. So here it is life expectancy as a factor of GDP per capita. The x in these scatter charts always imply a causation, even though, as we'll talk about, that's not always the case. But when in implying a causation, you want to put the input, right? What's causing the input on the x-axis and the output on the y-axis. So this is implying that GDP leads to an increase in life expectancy per year, life expectancy. So that's what they're communicating here, and then they have the scatter plot, and then they use a line to show kind of like the overall trend in the data, right? It's a nice chart, and then obviously this is to show population size as a degree of like significance here. So speaking of then correlation versus causation, we have to talk. I know a lot of you have heard about this, but we have to talk about this if you ever just are. If you're able to build a scatter chart, then we just have to talk about the fact that correlation is not the same as causality. So everything that can go wrong, here there's like a relationship. There's always there's a relationship between education and income. So this is some data I took. You can see that as people have higher degrees, that earnings go up. But does that mean that education causes higher earnings? So what are the other things that can be occurring? So one is just like, yes, we see the correlation because having more education, allows people to earn more. The other case is like reverse causality, meaning having more money allows you to purchase more education. That also seems plausible, right? So you have to consider reverse causality. And then, a third thing that could be occurring is that something you're not considering is causing both an increase in education and an increase in income. So I don't have an example for that. It's probably a little awkward to think of one, but a classic one is, hey, look at the correlation between eating ice cream and people drowning. It's like, look, so does that mean that eating ice cream causes drownings? It's like, probably not. Probably it's temperature, which is causing, on days that it's hot, more people are eating ice cream and more people are drowning. And this, when I was taught this, it was called a lurking variable, which to me is like very descriptive. It's just like some other variable you're not considering could be what's occurring. And then, it could be in both directions, right? Poverty and food stamps, right? Like you could make the argument, I'm not advocating for either position, but someone could make the argument, right, that like poverty, obviously as more people are poor, that leads to more food stamps. And then of course, people would make the argument that also, because there's food stamps, people don't have to work less because, can work less because, they have this other option, right? And then of course, so there's bidirectional, there's reverse causality, there's lurking variables, and then there's also just coincidence. This is my favorite example of this. Number of people who drowned into a falling pool is highly correlated with the number of films that Nick Cage appeared in over time. So you can just see, like, this is a very close kind of line. And if you want to look at other ones, right, it's like divorce rate in Maine is highly correlated with per capita consumption of margarine. So you can just see lots of these. So what you need, so anyway, the whole point is, right, correlation and causation are not the same thing at all. What you want to do is like kind of both talk to people, or even better, see if you can set up an experiment. I have a reading on kind of we'll also deploy on experimental design to go through. But yeah, like that's just always, you always want to think through kind of other things that can be going on here and not say the word causality unless you're pretty confident or you have shown causality. All right, cool. Okay, so we can go through these I'll deploy the solution on this, and then what's next? Oh, and we can talk about the anagrams problem too. What's next is going to be actually like plotting this stuff with a library, so that will be nice. In terms of the anagrams, let me talk through this a little bit. Okay. Here's the trick to this guy, and we'll have like a more formal curriculum on like LeetCode type problems and how to approach them towards the end of the course. But one thing to look at here is it's called like the signature. I don't know why they call that of the data. So if something's an anagram, you can sort. Let's say we sort each one of these. Let's call this like, just because that's a keyword, and we do sorted of the anagram. Okay, and then we can join it. All right, where are our anagrams? Right, like E and T, and right, these are the three anagrams, and then these two are also anagrams, and then this one doesn't have one, right? So from there, I think that's the whole hint I'll give you, but from there, you should be able to then group them together. Okay, I would create a dictionary, right? Of probably like, this is the. Maybe I'll just do it. So these are our like sorted strings. And the way I would do it is go through each of these, go through each of the anagrams, and this is my sorted string. And then I'll create a dictionary. And then for each one, we'll have the sorted string, and yeah, I guess we'll do that. I'll do it in 2 steps. I'll do the sorted string and then have it equal to this, and then I'll just go through it again and say, okay, and that was just to show you what this will produce. So now I have each of the kind of the signatures, right, and a list. And now what I want to do, I just want to populate this list with each of the corresponding words, right? So that AET has eat, T, and 8, okay? So how do you do that? Well, you just go through this again, get the sorting, and then just assign it. So for each of these words, we'll sort it. We'll use that sorting to then append in the actual word. I think that will do it. I need a parentheses here. Okay. And I'm sure there's a more efficient, like I'm repeating myself here, but again, I just like solving it first, and then always can refactor it. So like I said, sorting is a very valuable kind of pre-processing technique. Many of these problems, like you kind of want to go through kind of, okay, should I coerce the data? And different ways of coercing the data is like, turning it into a list, turning it into a dictionary, create what I call like the histogram, right? A dictionary of the keys being the what's there, and the values being how many times each occurs. And then another thing is sorting the data. Sorting the data is really useful, can provide a lot of information. So this is an example of that, right? If words are the same when they're sorted, then they're anagrams of each other. Okay. And now what can I do from here? Just take the values and create a list. I get something like that messed up. Why did that happen? Whoa, I'm doing some weird stuff, aren't I? I think it's I just ran this multiple times. Sorry about that. Here's my anagram dict, and then have a dot values. Yeah, there you go. Okay, and then you can just take the list of this. E, T, and 8, tan and nat are together, and then bat is together. And that looks good. All right, I can share this. I'll put this in the chat. But I think the whole key is sort them, sort the characters, and then go from there. Cool.